Olive's Return, 1856. In February of 1856, with Burke's note in hand, a Quechan man named Francisco walks into the Mohave village, claiming authority to bring Olive back to Fort Yuma. I wonder how Olive found out. Did she hear about it from one of her friends? Was it Topeka? Espanol? Chief Espanol? Maybe she heard it from Francisco himself. When she did hear, what was that moment like for Olive? Was it a flash of hope, dread, or just shock and disbelief? It had been 5 years, almost to the day, since she was taken prisoner by her family's murderers. Now she's 18 years old. She speaks the Mohave language, has a Mohave name, is part of a Mohave family. She eats, works, and dresses as a Mohave. She is tattooed as a Mohave. What is she supposed to do now? Negotiations. Chief Espanol called a council and negotiations began. We don't know what the exact talking points were, but after 3 long days, Espanol denied Francisco's request for Olive. Beaten, but not defeated, Francisco didn't return to Fort Yuma. Instead, he crossed the river to another Mohave village where they advised him to offer gifts, which makes me wonder how that strategy didn't come up in the previous 3 days. Whatever the case, a second council was called, and for this one, Olive is present. Part of Olive's later writings of these events include her translating between the two parties, and how she saw Burke's note, and possibly others, that included the threat of white reprisals if she was not released. This seems unlikely, and admittedly, I'm a bit skeptical. Not just on the later writings attributed to Olive, which we'll discuss later, but also because there's such little evidence of those threats, and they don't quite track with other parts of the story. Olive might have later had reason to build up drama or conflict in recounting the events. The supposed threat of the U.S. government raining down on the Mohave would help counter the idea that Olive could have simply left whenever she wanted, but chose not to. That it took the threat of the U.S. government for the Mohave to release her helps protect Olive from scrutiny later on. Interestingly, we do have another account of the events. Years later, that same anthropologist who mentioned the Mojave's lewd nicknames earlier was studying the native peoples of the West and interviewed an old man named Tokwatha, or muskmelon, as it sometimes appears in some of the writings. Tokwatha had lived near Olive and was in the party that would accompany her to Fort Yuma. This anthropologist was named Alfred Kroeber. a leader in his field in the early 20th century, and father to writer Ursula Le Guin for any sci-fi readers out there. Togwatha told Krober a much gentler version of the events, where Chief Espanol was reluctant to give up Olive for personal, even affectionate reasons. Espanol said that he had gone out of his way to rescue and adopt Olive and Marianne. He and his wife, Espanio, had raised and cared for them like daughters. Of course, there were political considerations for Espanol as well. Assuming he was no dummy, he had to be aware of how to mitigate any retaliation from the whites. If he were to allow Olive to leave, one would assume, he might want to be sure that she emphasized how good she had it with the Mohave, and that she could have left at any time. Perhaps some of these motivations were also present in Togwatha's account so many years later. While Togwatha's version and Olive's later version seem at odds, a few things are clear. First, Olive never had anything negative to say about her adoptive family. Chief Espanol, Espanio, and Topeka. Even in her speeches years later, Olive remembered them all fondly. Second, Olive and Togwatha both had strong motivations for putting events in a certain light. Olive would later find herself having to justify how and why she left the Mohave, and Togwatha, even 40 years later, might want to make sure that no one could think that Olive was mistreated by the Mohave. After a few more days of negotiations, an agreement was reached. Olive would be allowed to leave, and the Mohave would receive gifts that included blankets, beads, and 2 white horses. Chief Espanol's daughter and Olive's adoptive sister, Topeka, would accompany her to Fort Yuma. Other members of the return party included Francisco's original group, his brother and 2 cousins, and Togwatha, the man who spoke with Krober so many years later. Leaving the Mohave. Olive said her goodbyes to her friends and to her neighbors. She said goodbye to Chief Espanol, who had been the one to facilitate her rescue from the Tocopaya. She said goodbye to Espanio, her adoptive mother, who saved her life during the famine and who grieved alongside her at Marianne's passing. Olive also visited Marianne's grave near the garden the 2 of them kept together one last time. Topeka was to accompany her to Fort Yuma, back to the whites, but soon they would say goodbye as well. And then Olive would once again be all alone. Once again be an outsider. Once again be powerless over how the events of her life unfolded. The trip would take 10 days, the same amount of time it took to reach the Mohave Valley from the Tocopaya village 4 years before. Forget about the rough terrain and inherent physical risks. What was Olive in for? Would she have to answer for the actions of her father? Why she was spared that terrible day? Why she didn't escape? Why she couldn't save Marianne? Were those slave tattoos on your face? What did they make you do as slaves? Let's remind ourselves. Olive didn't know what would happen next. We may know her story, or at least some outline of it, but she didn't know anything of what was to come. Nothing was inevitable. She was leaving a world where she at least had an adoptive family, a community, and a way of life that she was accustomed to. She was relatively safe and relatively accepted. Now she was returning to a world that would likely judge and objectify her for the rest of her life. Fort Yuma and Olive's first account. On February 22nd, 1856, 10 days after leaving her Mohave home, and 5 years and 4 days after the massacre that killed her family, Olive arrived at Fort Yuma. She and the traveling party had briefly waited to cross the river until Francisco had returned with a dress for her to wear. Remember, Mohave women were bare above the waist. Olive was welcomed by Commander Burke, who had authored Francisco's pass. And new dress or not, Olive's appearance must have been a sight to Burke. Deeply tanned from the sun, and of course, the tattoo on her chin. Olive was notably hesitant to speak. Maybe her English was a bit stilted. Maybe she was still in shock. Maybe she'd learned by then to keep her mouth shut until she knew which way the wind was blowing. In single-word responses, Olive answered questions asked by Burke. More a debriefing than an interrogation. You can read it online, and we have a link to it on our website and in the description below. Olive answered questions from Burke about the day of the massacre, assigning blame to Apaches, and how she was treated very well by the Mohave these past years. She mentioned that Marianne died 1 year ago, that is 1855, but she got other information wrong, so it's really hard to tell. And, at some point, she was told about Lorenzo. He was still alive. All these years later, and Lorenzo was alive. How could she even process that? Shock and disbelief? She had seen him get his head smashed in. She had seen him lay there motionless. Was it guilt over not trying to escape? Or, if allowed to, this entire time, to simply leave and find her brother? Maybe anger over not being found sooner? Before the tattoos, at least? Or was it shame for losing Marianne and for her new appearance? Hopefully, it was just joy at realizing that she, in fact, wasn't alone in this world, at least in this new world she was returning to. Later that very day, Burke sent word of Olive's return to Lorenzo, and soon the California newspapers picked up the story and public awareness started to grow. Burke then arranged for Olive to be under the care of a woman named Sarah Bowman. Sarah Bowman. If you research anyone after this in situ museum experience, and we hope you do yourself a favor and start with Sarah Bowman. Taking care of Olive Oatman, one of the most iconic women of the American West, was maybe the 10th most interesting thing about this woman. In fact, I hope we can do an entire in situ museum just for Sarah Bowman someday. Officially, Sarah Bowman was in charge of the food and laundry for Fort Yuma. Unofficially, she also ran the local brothel. 44 years old at the time of Olive's return, she had the excellent nickname, the Great Western, a reference to the largest ship afloat at the time, due no doubt to her, quote, well-proportioned figure on an over 6-foot-tall frame. A head of fiery red hair, Sarah was no slouch in the men department. She had a handful of husbands, all younger if that sort of thing interests you. Men that came into her orbit were apparently powerless to her looks and charm. Didn't matter if you were a soldier, a miner, prospector, or a politician. In fact, you'll find many of the fathers of Arizona, like Charles Poston, Edward Tuttle, and Sylvester Mowry, all crossed paths with this legendary lady. Before coming to Fort Yuma, Sarah Bowman fought alongside the Texas Rangers and was involved in multiple events in the Mexican-American War, where she was exceptionally loyal to General Zachary Taylor, national hero and 12th President of the United States. She may have even been awarded a military pension for her bravery and contributions in that war effort. Sarah Bowman also makes fictional appearances in both Cormac McCarthy's masterpiece of a novel, Blood Meridian, as well as Larry McMurtry's Dead Man's Walk. Sarah would adopt several children over the course of her life. But Olive, who was already 18 at the time, would not be among those adopted, likely only spending a few days with the ravishing Ms. Bowman. Now, in this in situ museum, we've tried to be respectful of Olive Oatman, the human being, while discussing Olive Oatman, the historical figure, including minimizing speculation about her sexuality and personal experiences. Who are we to judge anything Olive did or did not do? But if ever there was anyone for a 19th century ex-Mormon, ex-Tokapaya captive, adopted Mohave woman to confide in about any private subject matter, it would be Sarah Ann Bowman. Though unlikely, I still like to imagine Olive getting it all out there with Sarah, if only to receive a single long, judgment-free listen once in her life. In the next section, Olive becomes famous. A book is written, and Olive gains control over her story. Mostly. But before moving on, despite my hopes, Olive probably didn't confide in Sarah Bowman, or anyone else for that matter. A century and a half of behavioral science later, we have some idea of what happens when people repress trauma and hold all those feelings in. Imagine an 18-year-old girl or woman in Olive's situation. What she's already been through and survived, but also what we all know she's in for once word of her return gets out there and people see her on the street with that tattoo. What are her options? What's the smart move from this point? Is there a smart move? In any century, what must it be like to have no anonymity? No place to get away from prying and judgmental eyes. If those are the cards that Olive was dealt, what do you think she should do? What's it going to take for her to make it through what's coming next? Talk it over with your group, and when you're ready, go ahead and play the next section, Stratton's Book and the Lecture Circuit, 1856 to 1865.